The first thing you need to know about me is that I don't do mornings. The second thing you need to know is that mornings don't care. 5:47 a.m. The radiator in our unit at the Elm Street Transitional Housing Complex was doing its usual impression of a dying robot, clanking, wheezing, producing roughly the thermal energy of a disappointed sigh. Outside, New Haven was wrapped in that particular shade of gray that October saves specifically for people who can't afford better windows. I was already awake, not because I wanted to be, not because I was one of those aggressively optimistic people who greet the dawn with gratitude and green smoothies. Number one, I was awake because my son, Micah, had climbed onto my chest at some point around 3 a.m., pressed his cold little nose against my collarbone, and declared in the absolute confidence of a 4-year-old that he was not even a little bit sleepy. He was now, of course, completely and profoundly asleep, on my arm, my entire left arm. Micah, I kept my voice low, mostly because the walls in this place were the structural equivalent of wet cardboard. Baby, move. He didn't move. He burrowed, like a small, determined animal who had identified warmth and made a territorial claim. I stared at the water stain on the ceiling, the one shaped vaguely like a wolf howling, which felt like a personal attack from the universe. And I did what I always did at 5:47 a.m. in late October with no heat, no feeling in my left arm, and exactly $14 in my bank account. I took inventory. Micah, breathing, warm, alive, good. That was the whole list. That was all that needed to be on the list. Everything else was just logistics. My name is Eliot Voss, 23 years old. Omega, unregistered, which in the state of Connecticut in the year of our Lord was approximately 17 kinds of illegal, and the subject of 3 separate notices from the New Haven PAC Authority that I kept using as coasters, because I ran out of coasters in August. Former resident of the Hargrove PAC territory, which is a polite way of saying I used to belong somewhere, before I got formally, officially, and publicly rejected in front of approximately 200 witnesses at the age of 19. But we'll get to that. The superpower thing came first. It started when I was 16. A slow burn of wrongness that I initially blamed on puberty, then on stress, then on the fact that I'd eaten gas station sushi on a dare. But it kept happening. Small things. A classmate's panic bleeding into my chest before she raised her hand to answer. The lunch monitor's boredom settling over me like a fog so thick I nearly fell asleep face first into my mashed potatoes. My best friend's heartbreak 3 days before she even knew her boyfriend was going to break up with her. I was reading emotions, not just picking up on body language the way any observant person could, actually reading them. The full weight, color, and texture of what other people felt pouring into me like water into a glass. Joy tasted like citrus. Grief was gray and heavy, like wet wool. Rage was red-orange and smelled faintly of copper. By the time I was 17, I could project back. Not control, I want to be clear about that. I'm not some comic book villain sitting in a swivel chair and bending minds like aluminum foil. It was more like amplification. If someone was calm, I could feed that calm back to them. Doubled. If someone was spiraling into panic, I could reach in and find the one thread of steadiness still inside them and pull it forward until they could breathe again. The Hargrove PAC called it a gift from the moon goddess. I called it exhausting. I also called it the reason I never got a moment's peace in a crowd, the reason I couldn't set foot in a shopping mall without my head feeling like a snow globe someone had shaken too hard, and the reason I was very, very careful about who I let touch me. The Hargrove PAC's reaction to discovering their Omega with emotion reading abilities was, predictably, complicated. PAC elder Margaret Hargrove, a woman built like a filing cabinet and possessed of roughly the same warmth, immediately identified 3 potential uses for my ability: PAC therapy, unpaid; negotiation support, unpaid; and scent masking verification during heat cycles, deeply invasive and also unpaid. I said no to all 3. She said Omegas didn't get to say no. I said, watch me. That went well. I pulled Micah's small body carefully off my arm, tucking the blanket tighter around him. He made a sound like a disgruntled seal and rolled over, one fist pressed against his cheek, eyelashes fanned dark against his skin. 4 years old and already the most beautiful person I'd ever seen. And he had my dark hair and my stubborn jaw, and eyes that shifted between brown and something that wasn't quite green and wasn't quite gold. Eyes that didn't come from me. Eyes I recognized every single time I looked at him and felt something complicated move through my chest. I got up quietly, pulling on 2 pairs of socks and the oversized Connecticut Husky sweatshirt that had been my primary thermal regulation strategy since September. The kitchen, which was generous, since it was really a counter with ambitions, held one nearly empty bag of oats, half a jar of peanut butter, and the quiet judgment of a fruit bowl containing 2 sad apples and my dignity. I made oatmeal. I made it the way Micah liked it. Extra cinnamon, peanut butter stirred in while it was still hot, the 2 sad apples diced small on top because vegetables, and or whatever apples were, fruit, vitamins. The point was nutrition. The point was I was trying. I ate mine standing at the counter, looking out the window at the pre-dawn street below. A city bus rumbled past, its lights cutting through the gray. A man walked a dog. Somewhere down the block, a PAC-registered household had their porch light on. That particular warm amber that registered PAC housing got from the authority as part of the safety incentive program. Our porch light was a bare bulb I'd installed myself using a YouTube tutorial and probably voided 3 building codes. It worked, though. Some things you just figure out yourself, I thought, and immediately hated how philosophical that sounded before coffee. I didn't have coffee. I had oatmeal and 2 sad apples, and Micah, who was about to wake up in approximately 6 minutes with the full kinetic energy of a small natural disaster, and I had a double shift at Anchor and Stone Coffee, a legitimately excellent cafe on Chapel Street that paid me legitimately terrible wages and had no idea their barista was an unregistered Omega with emotion reading abilities and a child who was technically the biological heir to 2 of the most powerful PAC territories on the eastern seaboard. Allegedly, biologically. Look, it's complicated. It was a Thursday, which meant the morning regulars at Anchor and Stone would include Professor Hale from Yale Law, who ordered a pour-over and always looked like he was internally drafting a very sad brief, the 3 graduate students who took up the back table from 7 to 11 and survived entirely on cold brew and collective anxiety, and, starting about 3 weeks ago, a rotating series of very large, very well-dressed men who arrived in black SUVs and ordered black coffee and said nothing but whose emotional signatures hit me like standing in front of a speaker at full volume. PAC enforcers, high-level ones. I knew their scent category the same way I knew a storm was coming before the clouds rolled in. Something electric and animal and old, layered under expensive cologne, and the particular carefully controlled blankness of someone trained not to broadcast. Whatever PAC they were from was local, newly active in New Haven, and absolutely none of my business. I was minding mine with the focused intensity of a professional. Micah's daycare, a place called Little Seeds, run by a woman named Ms. Oni Patricia, who was in her late 60s and had the emotional signature of a warm fireplace and zero nonsense, opened at 7. I needed to have him there by 7:15 to catch the 7:22 bus that got me to Chapel Street by 7:45, which left me 13 minutes to change into my work apron, turn on the espresso machine, and transform from Eliot Voss, exhausted single father surviving on spite and oatmeal, into Eliot, friendly barista, who remembered your order and made your Monday slightly less terrible. I was good at my job. I was genuinely, honestly good at it. Not because of the power, I didn't use it at work mostly, beyond the low-level passive reading I couldn't turn off even if I wanted to. I was good at it because I paid attention, because I learned what people needed before they asked, because I understood that sometimes a person ordering their usual wasn't really ordering coffee. They were ordering 3 minutes of being seen by someone who wasn't going to make them justify their existence first. I understood that one personally. Micah woke up at 6:03 with a declaration. I dreamed about a horse, and it was wearing a hat. Was it a good hat? It was a cowboy hat. He sat up, hair destroyed, expression grave. The horse chose it himself. Good for the horse, I said. Pants. I don't want pants. Pants aren't optional, Micah. Why not? Society. He considered this with the serious expression he got when he was deciding whether an argument was worth it. He determined it wasn't. Pants were located. They were not put on immediately. Because first there was a very important question about whether oatmeal was a horse's favorite food, which led to a brief educational tangent about horse diets that I was not emotionally prepared for at 6 a.m., but delivered anyway, because this is what parenting is. By 6:52, we were out the door, Micah's small hand in mine, his backpack, decorated with iron-on dinosaurs that Miss Patricia had given him for his birthday, bouncing against his shoulders. The morning air was cold and clean, the kind that made New Haven look almost picturesque, the old Yale buildings rising Gothic and golden against the pale sky. Micah pressed close to my side, and I felt what I always felt walking through the city with him, the low, constant hum of my own vigilance, eyes moving, checking. The pack enforcers' SUVs hadn't been on Elm Street, but they'd been 3 blocks over on Crown, and I noted it the way I noted everything that moved in the periphery of our lives. We were unregistered. We were invisible, technically, but invisible and safe were not the same thing, and I had learned that lesson at 19 years old in front of 200 witnesses, and I had not forgotten it. Eliot, Micah tugged my hand. Yeah, baby. Is my dad coming today? The question landed the way it always did, quiet and precise, like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples went deep. I kept my face easy, kept my voice easy. This was a skill I had developed with the same grim dedication I'd applied to every other survival skill in my life. Not today, bud. Oh, a pause. The small child processing pause I knew well. Oh, does he know where we live? Does he know you exist, I thought. Does he know either of you exist? Does he know what he threw away? He doesn't, I said, but that's okay. We're good, right? You and me? Micah looked up at me with those not quite green, not quite gold eyes. Eyes I knew. Eyes that lived 4 years in my memory like a splinter I'd never fully gotten out. We're good, he agreed, with the simple certainty of a child who still believed that the people who loved him could keep him safe from anything. I squeezed his hand. I will, I promised him, silently. I will keep you safe from everything, including the truth, for as long as I possibly can. We walked the rest of the way to Little Seeds in the thin morning light, and I let myself think, just for a moment, just for the length of 1 city block, about the 2 men whose child was holding my hand. Alpha King Declan Ashworth of the Ashworth Eastern Territory, 28 years old, tall, controlled, glacier cold, and possessed of a scent like pine resin and thunderstorm air that had once made my entire nervous system forget its own name. He'd been the one who rejected me. He'd done it cleanly, efficiently, publicly, and without apparent emotion, the way a man like him did everything, as a policy decision rather than a personal one. He'd looked at me across the pack assembly floor and he'd said, in his quiet, devastating voice, I'm choosing to dissolve the scent bond. And then he'd turned back to his advisors and he'd never looked at me again. I'd been 4 weeks pregnant. I didn't know that yet. And neither Alpha King Rowan Calloway had bothered to stay either. He'd left 3 days before the assembly, called north on Ashworth Pack business, which was convenient timing that I'd spent 4 years deciding whether to attribute to cowardice or politics or simple cosmic cruelty. Rowan was different from Declan. Louder, warmer, the kind of man who made a room relax by existing in it. He smelled like cedar smoke and river water. He'd kissed my temple once, soft and distracted, like it was a reflex, like I was someone he'd been kissing his whole life. He was the only person I'd ever met whose emotional signature I couldn't fully read. Not because he was closed off, because he was genuinely, constitutively complicated. Joy and grief running simultaneously, ambition threaded through with something that felt like homesickness. And underneath all of it, something so steady and warm, it felt like standing near a fire on a cold night. I'd loved him for that. I'd loved them both for different terrible reasons, and then they'd both left and I'd figured out I was pregnant in the bathroom of a Greyhound bus station in Hartford, Connecticut, holding a test I'd bought from a vending machine, and I'd made a decision. I'd made the decision that the child I was carrying would never know rejection as his first memory, would never grow up understanding his worth through the eyes of men who hadn't had the sense to recognize it, would grow up knowing he was wanted, completely, unconditionally, with the full force of everything I had, even if what I had was two sad apples and a sweatshirt and bones that ached in the cold. I dropped Micah at Little Seeds. He walked in without looking back. Social butterfly, completely undamaged by a world that hadn't gotten to him yet. And Miss Patricia caught my eye over his head and gave me the small nod that meant, "We've got him. You can go." I went. Chapel Street was already alive when I arrived. Early morning New Haven in full swing. Students, faculty, the hospital workers from Yale New Haven on the early shift. The pack-adjacent businesses opening up with their registered territory markers glowing soft on their doors. I slipped in through Anchor and Stone's back entrance, tied my apron, started the espresso machine, and became, for the next 8 hours, someone who was fine. Someone who was doing just fine. The morning rush hit like it always did. Waves of need and warmth and caffeine desperation washing over me. Everyone's emotional signature bumping up against mine in the small warm space of the cafe. I managed it the way I always did, a light touch, keeping myself slightly separate, letting it wash past without letting it in. Professor Hale came in at 7:55, and I had his pour-over ready before he reached the counter. He looked up, surprised the way he was always surprised, and his emotional signature softened from its usual grim professional anxiety into something almost like ease. "You always know," he said. "I just pay attention," I said. By 9:15, I was in a rhythm. By 9:30, I was running on autopilot and my second-to-last reserve of human feeling, doing the mental math on whether $14 could become groceries and bus fare, and Micah's Wednesday field trip permission fee, without me performing some kind of numerical miracle. It couldn't. I knew it couldn't. I was going to have to call the pack assistance line, which I hated with the precise burning hatred of a man who had too much pride and not enough options. Because the pack assistance line required registration, and registration required a home pack affiliation, and my home pack had publicly rejected me, which created a bureaucratic situation so circular and pointless it could have been designed specifically to keep unregistered Omegas from accessing help, which honestly, it probably was. The bell above the cafe door chimed. I looked up. 2 men walked in, not the usual enforcer types, no visible pack markings, civilian clothes, but the particular way they moved through the space said alpha, the way a wolf moving through a forest says predator without making a sound. The taller one, dark coat, his jaw like a geological feature, eyes doing a quiet, tactical sweep of the room that he probably thought was invisible, stopped 3 steps inside the door. His gaze landed on me, and my power, my careful, controlled, always managed power, the ability I had spent 4 years learning to govern like a nation at war with itself, lurched sideways because his emotional signature hit me like a wall. Pine resin, thunderstorm, ice over something that burns. The ground didn't move. Floors don't move. I know this rationally, but for approximately 2 seconds, standing behind the counter of Anchor in Stone Coffee on Chapel Street in New Haven, Connecticut, holding a portafilter and wearing an apron that said grounds for celebration, something in my entire nervous system screamed a single word in the tone of a 5-alarm fire. No. Idiot Declan Ashworth looked at me across the cafe, and the 4 years I had spent becoming someone entirely different collapsed like paper in the rain. He didn't recognize me, not yet, but he would. Oh, he absolutely would. But not yet. Not if I had anything to say about it. I turned back to the espresso machine with the calm, unhurried movement of a man who had not just had his entire nervous system hijacked by a ghost from his worst year. I tamped the grounds. I locked the portafilter. I pressed the button. The machine hissed. Normal sounds, real sounds. The sounds of a person who was fine and employed and absolutely not currently running 17 different disaster scenarios in the back of his mind while trying to remember what a latte was. Espresso, milk, foam, in that order. I knew this, and I had made approximately 4,000 of these. I could make one right now without looking, without thinking, without letting my hands shake. My hands were not shaking. They were also not particularly steady, but we were going to call that a draw and move on. The second man, the one who had walked in beside Declan, moved to the counter first. He was shorter by maybe 2 inches, broader in the shoulders, with close-cropped dark hair, and the kind of face that looked like it had opinions about everything and was comfortable sharing them. His emotional signature was sharp and bright, curiosity wrapped around professional assessment, and under that, the particular restless energy of someone who spent too much time indoors doing things they found boring. Pack advisor, maybe. Or a very well-dressed enforcer with better people skills than the ones I'd been seeing all week. He looked at the menu board with genuine interest, which already made him more personable than most of the alpha-adjacent men who had been rotating through this cafe for 3 weeks. "What's good?" he asked. His voice was easy, American, slight Connecticut accent, the kind of tone that expected to be liked and usually was. I looked at him, read him in half a second, slightly undercaffeinated, genuinely uncertain between sweet and bitter. The kind of person who ordered things they didn't actually want because they felt weird asking for what they did. "Depend," I said. "Do you actually want coffee, or are you one of those people who wants coffee-flavored dessert but feels like they shouldn't admit it?" He blinked, and then he laughed. A real one, surprised out of him. "The second one," he said. "Absolutely the second one. Caramel cortado with oat milk and a half pump of vanilla," I said. "You'll feel like an adult, and it'll taste like a decision you made on purpose." "Done!" He pointed at me like I'd solved something. "I like you." "Most people do," I said. "That's $12. He was already reaching for his wallet, still smiling, and I had exactly 4 more seconds before the other man reached the counter, and I needed to use them wisely. I used them to decide on a strategy. The strategy was be invisible. Not literally. I couldn't turn invisible, which was honestly a recurring disappointment. My ability ran on emotion, not physics, but I could be unremarkable. I could be the background. And I had spent 19 years in pack territory learning how to be the version of myself that didn't draw attention, and I was very, very good at it when I needed to be. The problem, the specific, infuriating, cosmically unjust problem, was that my power didn't work the way I needed it to right now. Because Declan Ashworth's emotional signature wasn't the kind of thing you managed. It was the kind of thing that happened to you. 4 years ago, it had felt like standing too close to a lightning strike. Right now, with him 10 feet away and drifting closer, it felt like the air pressure in the room had changed, like a storm was deciding whether to break. His emotional signature in this moment was controlled. Deliberately, precisely, expensively controlled. The kind of blank that took training to maintain. Under it, I caught fragments. Fatigue, the weight of something unresolved, and something else I didn't have a name for yet. Something that pulsed low and searching like a signal being broadcast to no one. I hated that I could feel it. I hated that it made something in me want to answer. He stepped up to the counter. Up close 4 years later, he was exactly the same and completely different. Same height, 6'3", the kind of tall that didn't feel aggressive so much as simply architectural, like he'd been designed to take up more space than ordinary people. Same jaw, same dark hair worn short at the sides, slightly longer on top, the kind of effortless that cost money. Same gray eyes, the particular pale gray that looked almost silver in certain light and had once looked straight through me like I was something he was trying to solve. The difference was in the set of his shoulders, the slightly deeper crease between his brows, the way his hands, when he set them on the counter, pressed down just a little too hard, a man carrying something he didn't intend to show. His gaze moved over my face with the efficient scan of someone cataloging a space rather than seeing a person. He didn't recognize me. Of course he didn't. People who reject you rarely memorize what you look like. They're usually too busy moving on. I had cut my hair. I'd been 19 and soft-faced and desperate to be chosen, and now I was 23 with angles in my face that hadn't been there before, sharper in the way that 4 years of surviving on determination and oatmeal tends to make a person. Different city, different context, and no pack scent on me, Unregistered meant no territorial markers, which was illegal but also right now, spectacularly convenient. He looked at me and he saw a barista. Fine by me. Coffee, he said, black. Size, large. Name for the order? A pause, brief, almost imperceptible. His eyes sharpened slightly. Not recognition, just the slight recalibration of a person who was used to being known without having to introduce himself. Welcome to the real world, I thought. Out here we use names. Declan, he said. I wrote it on the cup. I wrote it with the same pen I'd used all morning, in the same handwriting, with exactly zero visible reaction. My emotion reading ability was rioting under my skin. His proximity was like pressing a bruise I'd forgotten I had. But my face did not move. My hands did not shake. I set the cup on the bar, turned to the espresso machine, and pulled his shot. Behind me, I heard the advisor settle into the chair closest to the window. I heard Declan remain standing at the counter. Most customers moved after ordering. He hadn't moved. I kept my back to him and waited for it to pass. It didn't pass. You've been here long? He asked. I turned around because not turning around would be weird. About 3 years, I said. The café. Oh. I looked at him with the mild, pleasant expression of a service industry professional who was paid to be personable and was choosing to deploy exactly the minimum required amount of personability. 4 months. He nodded slowly. His eyes were doing the thing again. That cataloging sweep, not unfriendly exactly, but not warm. For the eyes of a man who processed information constantly and couldn't turn it off. I understood that particular affliction personally. The pack presence in this neighborhood, he said. You noticed it? And there it was. Not small talk, a question with a shape to it. His emotional signature shifted. Professional focus sliding over the fatigue, the searching thing going quiet as something more alert took its place. I looked at him for a moment. On the one hand, he was asking an unregistered Omega about pack activity in an unregistered area, which was either a power play, a test, or genuinely the most obtuse approach to information gathering I had ever witnessed. On the other hand, he didn't know I was unregistered. He was asking a barista. He thought he was asking a civilian. I notice most things, I said pleasantly. When 3 black SUVs, he said. Rotating positions. Morning arrival, mid-afternoon departure. You'd have seen them. I put his coffee on the counter. That's $4. He looked at the cup, looked at me. Something flickered in the gray eyes. Not quite amusement, but adjacent. He put a 20 on the counter and didn't ask for change. Keep it, he said. I looked at the 20. I looked at him. I picked it up, opened the register, put in $4, and held the 16 out to him. He stared at it. I tipped, he said. I saw. $16 is a significant tip on a $4 coffee. I'm aware of that. Right. I kept my hand extended. So am I. His jaw shifted. Not anger. Something closer to surprise, which on a face like his looked almost exactly the same as mild offense. He took the $16. His fingers brushed mine. 1 second. Less than 1 second. The brief incidental contact of a hand-to-hand transaction in a coffee shop, the kind that happened 100 times a day and meant nothing and lasted less than a breath. His emotional signature detonated, not outward. Nothing changed on his face, nothing changed in his posture. But under my skin, where my ability lived and breathed and cataloged everything, whether I wanted it to or not, something cracked open in him. 1 instant of unguarded signal, raw and immediate, bleeding through his control like light under a door he hadn't meant to leave open. Recognition. Not of me, not of my face, not my name. Something older than that. Something that lived below the cognitive, even in the part of the brain that operated on scent and instinct and the animal certainty of the Omegaverse bond. His hindbrain knew me. His hindbrain was screaming at him right now, and he had absolutely no idea why. I pulled my hand back. His fingers curled slightly where mine had been. His expression didn't change, but his scent, the pine resin and thunderstorm air that had once undone me entirely, shifted, opened, a single note underneath it now, warmer and more uncertain, like a question being asked by a part of him that his rational mind hadn't given permission to speak. I turned back to the espresso machine. My heart was a problem. I needed it to behave, and it was categorically refusing. You dissolved the bond, I thought at the back of his head, where he was standing very still in a way that probably looked casual and was not. Well, you made that choice. You don't get to have an instinct about it 4 years later. The advisor called from the window table. December Haverford called. I'll call him back. His voice was completely normal. It's about the territory boundary meeting. Today. I said I'd call him back, Miles. A pause. I heard the advisor, Miles, do the specific kind of silence that people do when they want to say something and are deciding against it. Declan picked up his coffee. I heard him take a step away from the counter. He stopped. I kept my back to him. What's your name? He asked. My neck prickled. I turned around because not turning around was its own kind of answer. I looked at him across the counter with the easy, professionally pleasant expression of Eliot the barista, who had nothing to hide and no reason to feel the way he was currently feeling, and definitely no child 4 miles away at a daycare with this man's bone structure and his co-parent's eye color. Eliot, I said. He repeated it, low almost to himself, the way you repeat a word when you're not sure why it sounds familiar. I watched his face. Nothing landed. Not yet. I was 23 and sharp-faced and unscented by any pack, and he had made the decision to dissolve our bond without looking back, and then spent 4 years looking in every other direction. The name Eliot Voss was not currently connecting to anything in his conscious memory. Give it time, I thought, or rather, give it none. Give it no time at all. Finish this coffee, get through this shift, pick up my son, go home, and figure out a new cafe on the other side of New Haven to work at immediately. Good coffee, he said. I know, I said. The corner of his mouth moved. Less than a smile. More than nothing. He walked to the window table and sat down across from Miles, and I turned back to the counter and breathed through my nose for approximately 4 seconds. Okay. Okay. I was okay. I was extremely okay. I was a person who was okay. The next customer stepped up. One of the grad students, Hannah, whose emotional signature today was the academic equivalent of a building on fire. And I smiled at her and said, usual? And she said, please, double shot, I'm begging. And I made it exactly right, and the world kept turning. For about 6 minutes. Then the cafe door opened again. I was in the middle of explaining to Hannah that yes, and I was almost certain she could still pass her thesis defense if she just slept for one consecutive night, when the cold October air pushed in through the open door and hit me along with an emotional signature that stopped every single thought in my head simultaneously. Cedar smoke, river water. And underneath it, the thing I'd never been able to fully read, that impossible simultaneous depth, joy and grief and steadiness and warmth, running together the way rivers ran together at a confluence, each one distinct and somehow more itself for the meeting. The cup in my hand tilted. I caught it. I caught it before a single drop hit the counter, with the reflexes of a man who had learned to catch things before they fell and put them back together and never let anyone see the moment they'd almost broken. Hannah said something, and I answered. I don't know what either of us said. Rowan Calloway walked into Anchor and Stone Coffee on Chapel Street in New Haven, Connecticut, and stopped inside the door and looked across the room at his pack partner sitting by the window. And then, in the way of a man whose body made decisions independently of his schedule, turned his head and looked directly at me. He looked at me the way someone looks at a word they've been trying to remember for hours. Not recognition, not yet, but close. Much too close. Oh, I thought, with the profound, genuine, deeply inconvenient clarity of a man watching his most carefully constructed life begin to unravel at a pace he hadn't planned for. Both of them. Both of them are here. Today is genuinely not my day. For his emotional signature hit mine, and the warmth of it moved through me like the first real heat I'd felt all October. And I hated it. I hated that it still felt like that. And I set Hannah's double shot on the counter with a perfectly steady hand and smiled at the door like I smiled at every customer. Welcome to Anchor and Stone, I said, in the voice of a man who had never met Rowan Calloway in his life. "What can I get you?" His eyes were exactly the color I described to Micah when Micah asked why his eyes were that color. "Honey and winter light," I'd said. "The prettiest color there is." I'd told my son his eyes were beautiful. I had not told him where they came from. Rowan Calloway crossed the cafe in 7 steps. And when he reached the counter and the distance between us was close enough that his scent reached me properly for the first time in 4 years, something in my chest cracked open with a sound nobody else in the room could hear. He smiled at me. Full, easy, warm. The smile of a man who liked people genuinely and showed it without thinking. "Hey," he said, like we were old friends. Like the word was just something that happened naturally in my direction. Like every version of me that had loved him was still alive somewhere and had just heard its name called. "Hey," I said back. And my power, traitor that it was, reached toward him the way it always had. Instinctive and helpless and looking for that impossible depth. That signal I'd never been able to fully decode. What I found stopped my breath. Because underneath the warmth, underneath the easy charm, underneath 4 years of alpha king authority and pack responsibility and whatever carefully constructed life he'd been building since the day he'd left and not come back, Rowan Calloway was grieving. Quietly, constantly, completely. Like a man searching for something he'd lost and couldn't name. I looked at him. I looked at his eyes. Honey and winter light. I thought about a 4-year-old boy still asleep in a daycare nap corner 4 miles away, wearing a dinosaur backpack, dreaming about horses in cowboy hats. And I thought, with the precise, devastating clarity that only comes when the thing you've been afraid of is finally, undeniably standing in front of you. He's going to find out. They're both going to find out. The only question left is whether I control how. So I chose right now. I chose professionalism. I chose the apron and the counter and the careful geographic distance of a person whose job literally required a barrier between themselves and the customer. I chose the version of myself that had learned, slowly and painfully, that survival was mostly just a series of very deliberate choices made before your feelings got a vote. "What can I get started for you?" I asked. Rowan looked at the menu board the way people look at menus when they already know what they want, but need a second to think about something else. His emotional signature was still doing that thing, that quiet, constant grief running underneath everything like a bass note nobody else in the room could hear. I kept my ability pulled back, tight, controlled. I was not going to feel sorry for him. I was absolutely not going to feel sorry for him. "What's good?" we asked. Same question Miles had asked 20 minutes ago. Different energy entirely. Where Miles had been cheerfully indecisive, Rowan asked it like he was genuinely curious about my opinion. Like my answer mattered. I recognized that quality. It was the thing that had undone me the first time. Rowan Calloway made you feel like the most interesting person in the room without appearing to try. And the terrible thing about it was that it didn't feel like a tactic. It felt like just how he was. "Depends on what you need," I said, keeping my voice the same easy professional tone I use on everyone. "Fuel or comfort?" He tilted his head. "Can it be both?" "Sure," I said, "but one usually wins." He studied me for a moment. Not the cataloging sweep Declan did. Nothing tactical about it. Just looking. The way someone looks when they find something genuinely interesting and aren't embarrassed to show it. "Comfort," he said. "Definitely comfort. Honey latte, oat milk, 2 shots, splash of cinnamon on top." I was already reaching for the cup. $12. He paid without looking at the price. His eyes were still on my face in that unhurried way that was starting to make the back of my neck warm, and I needed it to stop immediately. "You always do that?" he asked. "Do what?" "Know what someone needs before they say it." I wrote his name on the cup, kept my handwriting steady. I've been making coffee for a long time. "It's not the coffee thing," he said. "It's a people thing. You read people." The cup in my hand was very still. "Most baristas do," I said. Not like that." His voice wasn't pushy about it, just certain. The tone of a man stating something he'd already decided was true. "You looked at me for 3 seconds and knew comfort over fuel. That's not a coffee skill." Across the room, I felt Declan's attention shift toward us. Not obvious, not loud, just the subtle reorientation of a man who tracked his environment automatically and had noticed that his pack partner was engaged in a conversation that was lasting longer than an order should. I did not look at Declan. I read body language, I said pleasantly. You walked in carrying something heavy. People carrying heavy things usually need comfort. It's not complicated. Rowan was quiet for a moment. His emotional signature shifted, and what came through was something I wasn't prepared for. Not grief this time. Well, it's something softer and more confused, like a person hearing a song they couldn't quite place, but knew they'd loved once. Fair enough, he said quietly. I turned to the espresso machine and pulled his shots, and I used the 45 seconds it took to have a very firm internal conversation with myself. The conversation went like this. No. That was the whole conversation. No. Not this. Not them. Not the way his voice did that thing, and not the way Declan's fingers had felt, and not the way my power kept reaching toward both of them, like it had never gotten the rejection memo. 4 years ago, they had made choices, and those choices had consequences, and one of those consequences was currently napping at Little Seeds daycare in a dinosaur backpack, and I was the only person in this cafe who understood the full geometry of this situation, and that meant I was the one who had to hold it together. I was always the one who had to hold it together. Story of my life. Genuinely. I finished his latte, added the cinnamon, turned back around. He was still there, which, yes, technically the counter was where you waited for your order, but something about the specific quality of his stillness suggested he wasn't just waiting for coffee. I set the cup down. Rowan. He picked it up, his fingers wrapped around the warmth, and something in his face eased slightly. I learned the way faces ease when they get exactly what they needed without having to ask twice. Thanks, Eliot, he said. I went still. Not visibly. I want to be clear about that. On the outside, I was a completely normal person, standing behind a completely normal counter, having a completely normal morning. But inside, in the part of me where my ability lived, and where 4 years of carefully maintained distance lived right alongside it, something went very quiet. He'd read my name off the cup. Of course he had. I'd written it right there. That was a completely normal thing that happened when someone read the name on their order. That was not a significant moment. That was literacy. I was being ridiculous. Enjoy it, I said. He smiled, and the grief under his surface flickered. Just for a second, 1 second of warmth winning over whatever he was carrying, and then he turned and walked toward the window table, where Declan and Miles were watching him with 2 very different expressions. Miles looked entertained. Declan looked like a man solving a math problem that was refusing to resolve. I turned to the next customer. The next customer was a woman named Jade from the hospital across the street who came in twice a week and always ordered a caramel macchiato and always looked like she'd already saved 2 lives before 10 a.m., which based on her emotional signature she usually had. I made her macchiato. I made the grad student's 3rd round. I restocked the pastry case. I did every single normal job function of a normal employed person having a normal Thursday. I did not look at the window table. And for 11 minutes, I did not look at the window table, which was a personal record and also an act of sheer stubborn will that deserved some kind of recognition. Then Miles said something that made Rowan laugh, and the sound of it moved through the cafe like a shift in temperature, and my head turned before I gave it permission. Rowan was looking at his phone, smiling at whatever Miles had said, and Declan was looking at me. Not at the cafe, not at the room, at me, with the expression of a man who has been trying to remember something for the last 40 minutes and is starting to feel genuinely unsettled by the fact that he can't. I looked back at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then I picked up a cloth and wiped down the counter with the calm energy of someone who had absolutely nothing to think about. And I thought about $14 and field trip permission slips and new cafes on the other side of New Haven, and I did not look at the window table again. But his gaze stayed on me. I could feel it the way you feel weather. And the worst part, the genuinely unfair part, was that underneath all that controlled assessment, underneath the tactical gray eyes and the careful blankness, Declan Ashworth's emotional signature was doing something it had never once done 4 years ago in all the time I'd known him. It was uncertain. Declan Ashworth, Alpha King, pack ruler, man who had rejected me in front of 200 people with the clinical efficiency of someone canceling a subscription, was sitting in my cafe looking at me like I was a question he desperately needed to answer. 4 years too late, I thought. 4 years. Only 11 months and approximately 16 days too late. I wrung out the cloth. I moved to the next section of counter. I kept my heart exactly where it was supposed to be, which was behind my ribs and not in my throat. And I reminded myself of the only thing that mattered. Micah. Everything else was noise. I repeated that to myself 3 more times while restocking the cup sleeves, which was a task that required approximately 0 brain cells, and therefore left the rest of them free to riot unsupervised. The window table was still occupied. Most customers at Anchor and Stone had a natural lifespan of 20 to 40 minutes. Coffee, laptop, leave. It was the unspoken social contract of cafe culture, and I appreciated it deeply. These 3 had been here for over 30 minutes, had ordered nothing additional, and showed 0 signs of the behavioral cues that preceded departure, which were closing laptop, gathering jacket, the specific restless shifting of a person who had decided they were done. None of that was happening. Miles had his phone out and was typing fast, the focused energy of someone managing logistics. Rowan had his honey latte cradled in both hands and was reading something on a tablet, his expression calm in that particular way that meant his brain was doing something complicated behind the calm. Declan had his black coffee, his own tablet, and his gaze, which kept returning to the counter with the regularity of a tide. Every time I looked up, he was either looking at me or had just stopped. I could feel the looking even when my back was turned, which was unfair and also technically not supernatural. Just the ordinary human awareness of being watched. Although my ability did amplify it somewhat, his attention had a texture to it, dense and focused and increasingly frustrated in a way that had nothing to do with the coffee. I started on the lunch prep because it gave me something to do with my hands that wasn't standing there being perceived. At 10:09, my coworker Bree arrived for her shift. She was 21, a Yale junior, and possessed of the efficient cheerfulness of someone who genuinely loved people and hadn't yet had enough disappointing experiences to complicate that. I liked her in the straightforward way. You like people who did their job well and didn't create drama. You look weird, she said, tying her apron. Good morning to you too. No, like, it's specifically weird. She studied me with the narrow focus of someone who had worked 3 shifts a week with me for 4 months. Did something happen? Nothing happened. I'm making sandwich prep. You hate sandwich prep. I hate lots of things. I do them anyway. That's called being an adult. She looked past me toward the cafe floor, doing the quick scan every good service worker did when they came on shift. Clocking the room, her eyes landed on the window table and stayed there for approximately 2 seconds longer than a standard scan required. Oh, she said, don't. Eliot, that's Declan Ashworth. I'm aware. And Rowan Calloway. Also aware. They're like the 2 most powerful alpha pack leaders on the Eastern Seaboard. They're in our cafe. They ordered coffee. They're customers. Need make the sandwiches. She turned to look at me with an expression that suggested she found my composure either impressive or deeply suspicious. Probably both. Do you know who they are? She asked. I know who everyone is, I said, which was true in more ways than she understood and was going to stay that way. She made the sandwiches. I managed the counter. The morning settled into its mid-morning rhythm, slower and warmer, the espresso machine taking a breath between rushes. At 10:24, Miles stood up, said something to the other 2, and walked out. His emotional signature as he passed the counter was the satisfied efficiency of a person who had finished their task list and was moving on to the next item. He gave me a small nod that was almost friendly. I gave him a professional smile that revealed nothing. Then there were 2. I restocked the syrup shelf. I realigned the pastry case. I considered briefly whether I could reasonably claim a medical emergency and leave early, and concluded that I could not because I needed this job, and also because running was not something I did anymore. I had done my running. I had run from Hartford to Bridgeport to here, and I had stopped, and I had built something, And I was not dismantling it because two men with expensive coats had ordered coffee and decided to take their time drinking it. At 10:31, Bree took her break. At 10:32, Rowan Calloway came back to the counter. He moved through the cafe the way he moved through everything, I remembered, like the space was already comfortable with him before he arrived. No announcement, no performance, just presence. He set his empty cup on the counter. "Yas, another one?" I asked. "Please." He settled onto one of the counter stools, which customers occasionally did during slow periods, and which I usually didn't mind and currently minded enormously. Same thing. I made it. The cafe was quiet enough that the sound of the espresso machine felt louder than usual, and the distance between the counter stool and where I was working was approximately 3 feet, which was 3 feet less than I preferred. His emotional signature at close range was even harder to manage than it had been at the door. That impossible layering, joy and grief running parallel. The steadiness underneath everything like bedrock. And something new now, something that hadn't been there in the first interaction. Curiosity, specific and directed. At me. "You said you read body language," he said. I kept my eyes on the milk steamer. "I did say that. So what does mine say right now?" I looked at him then, because not looking would have been an answer of its own. He was watching me with an expression that was open in a way Declan's never was, comfortable with being read, like he had nothing to hide and knew it. "It says you're a man who asks questions when he already suspects the answer," I said, "and that you find that interesting rather than unsettling." Something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly, more like confirmation. "That's a very specific read," he said. "You're a very specific person." The words came out slightly drier than I intended. He smiled and the grief under his surface flickered again, that same brief warming I'd seen earlier. And I looked away from it because it was not my grief to feel and not my warmth to want. I set his latte down. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You're going to regardless," I said. "But sure." He laughed, short and genuine. "Fair. How long have you been in New Haven?" "About 3 years. Before that?" "Various places." "Vague," he noted, without judgment. "Intentionally," I confirmed. He turned the cup slowly in his hands, the same way he had the first one, and I got the impression this was something he did when he was thinking, a grounding gesture, something habitual and probably unconscious. "We're setting up a secondary territory presence here," he said. "New Haven has a significant unregistered Omega population. The current PAC authority infrastructure isn't serving them." I kept my expression neutral. "That's very civic-minded," I said. "You say that like you don't believe it." "I say that like I've heard it before." He looked at me steadily. His emotional signature didn't spike defensively the way most people's did when they felt challenged. It just settled deeper, like something in him was leaning into the friction rather than away from it. "What have you heard?" he asked. "That PAC leadership comes into unregistered territories with resource programs and assistance promises," I said, keeping my voice even and pleasant. Because I was a professional, and this was a customer, and I was also a person who had spent 4 years watching PAC authority infrastructure fail people like me in creative new ways. And then the registration requirements come, and then the territorial fees. And then the people who were surviving fine on their own are suddenly in violation of 3 compliance codes they didn't know existed. The words sat between us. I waited for the defensive redirect, the leadership justification, the word different from other PACs, which every PAC said. What I got instead was silence. Then quietly, "You're unregistered." Not a question, not an accusation, just a man putting together information he'd already had and naming what it meant. My pulse moved. I looked at him across the counter with the steady, unbothered expression of someone who had nothing to be afraid of, which was not entirely true but was the version I intended to present. "My coffee is excellent," I said. "My registration status is my business." "I'm not here to report anyone," he said. "I'm not that kind of alpha." "Every alpha says that." "I know." He held my gaze. "I'm sorry that's true." The apology landed differently than I expected. Not performed, not strategic, just honest, with the particular weight of someone who meant it and knew it wasn't enough and said it anyway. My ability reached toward him before I could stop it. What I found was genuine. That was somehow worse than if it had been calculated. I pulled back, straightened, reached for the next task on the invisible list I kept running in my head. "Enjoy the latte," I said. He didn't move. "The boy in the photo," he said. Everything in me went very, very still. On the counter, beside the register, there was a small photograph. Micah at 3 years old, sitting on a park bench at East Rock. Juana wearing a red jacket and a hat shaped like a frog that he had insisted on, and that I had absolutely zero regrets about buying him. Laughing at something off camera, mouth wide open, eyes crinkled, those not quite green, not quite gold eyes catching the October light. I had forgotten it was there. I had worked here for 4 months and the photo had been there every single day, and not one customer had ever commented on it. And today, of all days, on the day that Rowan Calloway sat on a counter stool and asked questions with the patient persistence of a man who found things interesting. "My son," I said. My voice was completely normal. Rowan looked at the photo. He looked at it for a moment that lasted slightly too long, and I watched his face with the helpless, focused attention of someone watching a fuse burn towards something they couldn't stop. He looked up at me. His expression was unreadable in a way that had nothing to do with control. It was the expression of a person standing on the edge of a realization that was too large to process all at once. The mind taking it in slowly because taking it in fast would be too much. "He has interesting eyes," Rowan said carefully. "He gets that a lot," I said. The space between those two sentences contained approximately 4 years of everything I had never said. Rowan's emotional signature was doing something I had no category for. The grief and the steadiness and the warmth were all still there. But now something electric was running through all of it. Something urgent and unformed. A question his body was asking that his mind hadn't caught up to yet. Across the cafe, Declan looked up from his tablet. He looked at Rowan. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at the photograph on the counter. The math in his gray eyes started moving. I picked up a cloth. I wiped down the counter. I breathed through my nose and thought about field trip permission slips and the $14 in my account and the very practical logistical question of how long it would take me to find a new job. Not long, I decided. I was an excellent barista. I could find work anywhere. The question was whether anywhere would be far enough. Probably not. That was the honest answer I gave myself while wiping the same section of counter I had already wiped twice. Sounding which was the kind of behavior that happened when your hands needed to be doing something and your brain was too busy running emergency calculations to give them better instructions. Declan stood up, not fast, not dramatically. He closed his tablet with the quiet finality of a man who had made a decision and was now executing it. And he crossed the cafe in the unhurried way he did everything, like the space had already agreed to accommodate him before he moved through it. He stopped beside Rowan's stool. The two of them together at my counter was a specific kind of sensory experience I had not prepared for. Their emotional signatures didn't cancel each other out the way opposite forces sometimes did. They layered. Pine resin and thunderstorm over cedar smoke and river water. Alpha and alpha. And underneath both of them, that low searching frequency I had been feeling all morning. Louder now, more urgent, two signals broadcasting on the same frequency without knowing it. I looked at both of them. They looked at me. Rowan looked at the photograph. "How old is he?" Declan asked. His voice was entirely neutral. The tone he used for information gathering, for facts, for things that needed to be understood before conclusions could be drawn. I recognized it. 4 years ago, that voice had said things like, "The bond dissolution is a PAC authority matter, and this decision is final in exactly that register." Hearing it now, directed at a photograph of my son, produced a feeling in my chest that I did not have a clean name for. It was somewhere between rage and grief, and the particular exhausted bitterness of a person who had been waiting for a moment like this for so long that the arrival of it felt less like explosion and more like a door finally opening on a room that had been locked for years. "4," I said. Declan's jaw moved. A small shift, barely visible. His emotional signature spiked once, hard and bright, and then his control came down on it like a hand pressing a flame flat. Rowan made no sound, but his grip on his latte cup tightened, the ceramic creaking slightly under his fingers, and the grief in him surged upward and hit me like a wave breaking. The silence lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds was a long time. His other parent, Declan said carefully, are they in the picture? And there it was. The question shaped exactly right to seem like small talk and means something entirely else. The words of a man whose instincts had been screaming at him for the last hour and who was now, in his controlled, methodical way, beginning to ask the questions that would either confirm or disprove what those instincts were telling him. I looked at Declan Ashworth across the counter of my café. I thought about 19-year-old me standing on the assembly floor of the Hargrove Pack territory in the cold, wearing the formal presentation clothes I had borrowed from my pack sister because I owned nothing appropriate, waiting for a bond confirmation that everyone had told me was a formality, a ritual, something that happened after the scent match and the biological confirmation, and the 3 months of quiet, devastating, absolutely mutual pull between an omega and 2 alphas who had looked at me like I was something they had been waiting for without knowing it. I thought about the way Declan had looked across that room, the way he had said the words, the way I had understood, in the space between one breath and the next, that the scent match and the biological confirmation and the 3 months had not meant to him what they had meant to me. I thought about Rowan's empty chair. I thought about the Greyhound Station bathroom in Hartford, the vending machine test, the specific quality of silence when you understand that the life you thought you were building has already ended, and you are the last one to find out. No, I said, they're not. My voice was level. I was proud of my voice. Rowan set his cup down. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been. The easy warmth of earlier pulled inward, replaced with something careful and intent. Eliot, he said, where are you from originally? And there was the question. Not New Haven, not Connecticut. Originally. I looked at him. His honey-colored eyes were very steady and very focused, and the thing running under his grief right now was something that felt like standing at the top of a drop, the moment before you committed to falling, the last second where everything could still be something other than what it was about to become. I could lie. I want to be clear that lying was available to me as an option. I was a gifted, practiced, highly experienced liar when the situation required it and the situation currently required it. I could say Ohio. I could say Boston. I could say somewhere generic and mid-sized and unverifiable and redirect the conversation and survive this shift and collect Micah from Little Seeds and be in a different neighborhood by Friday. I could do that. I also knew with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had spent 4 years carrying a secret that had always been too large for one person, that the lie was running out of room. That photograph had done it. Those eyes had done it. The scent recognition from the finger brush had done it. I hadn't caused any of it, and I hadn't been careless, and I had done every single thing right, and it was still running out of room, because that was the thing about truth. It didn't wait for convenient timing. Connecticut, I said, which was technically accurate. I had been living in Connecticut for nearly 4 years. Declan's eyes sharpened. He had heard the precision of it, the way it answered the surface of the question and nothing underneath. He was a man who negotiated pack law and territorial boundaries for a living, and he understood exactly what careful language sounded like and why people used it. You went to a pack territory before New Haven, he said, not a question. Most Omegas do at some point, I said pleasantly. Which one? I don't see how that's relevant to your coffee order. I'm not asking about my coffee order. No, I agreed. You're not. The frankness of it seemed to catch him slightly off guard. His emotional signature shifted, that controlled blankness developing a small crack. Something underneath it pressing forward. Not anger. Something that wanted very badly to be anger, and was something more complicated. Tana Abri came back from her break, clocked the atmosphere at my counter with the rapid situational awareness of a 21-year-old who had grown up in a pack household and understood what elevated alpha tension smelled like, and immediately found something to do in the back room. Good instincts, Bree. Rowan turned on his stool so he was facing me more directly. The movement was slow and deliberate, and his voice when he spoke was lower, quieter, meant just for the space between us. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "and I'm not telling you to make you uncomfortable. I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know that I'm not here by accident." My hand on the counter was still. "We've been looking," he said, "for an Omega for about 8 months. Quietly, without PAC authority involvement, because the circumstances are private. Someone who left a territory under difficult conditions about 4 years ago." He paused. "Someone whose scent bond records were dissolved without full bilateral consent, which is a PAC law violation. Someone who should have had protections that they didn't get." The cafe was very quiet. The espresso machine was not running. No one was waiting at the counter. The grad students in the back had their headphones in and were not paying attention to anything except their own private academic catastrophes. It was just the three of us and the truth that had been building since 9:31 a.m. and the photograph of a 4-year-old boy with honey-colored eyes sitting on a park bench in October light. "You've been looking," I said. "Where's yes?" "For 8 months." "Yes." I breathed in slowly, breathed out. My ability was not under control right now, and I was not pretending that it was. Rowan's grief was everywhere, real and raw and soaked into 4 years of searching that had apparently not been nothing. Declan's control surface had developed a fault line, something urgent and guilty pressing up against the underside of everything he was holding flat. Guilt. Declan Ashworth was carrying guilt the size of a territory. I filed that away in the place where I kept things I didn't have time to process yet. "Why?" I asked. My voice was very quiet. "Why look?" Rowan held my gaze, and what came through his emotional signature in that moment was so unguarded it almost hurt to receive. Not performed, not strategic, just a man saying the thing that was true. "One, because we were wrong," he said. "What happened at that assembly was wrong. What I did by not being there was wrong. And we have spent a long time understanding that, and not enough time actually fixing it." Something moved through my chest. Not forgiveness. I want to be completely honest about that. It was not forgiveness, because forgiveness was something I had not agreed to give, and would not be handing over in a cafe on a Thursday morning to two men who had walked back into my life with expensive coats and good intentions, and approximately 4 years of overdue accountability. It was something more complicated than forgiveness. It was the recognition that the version of this moment I had rehearsed in my head for 4 years, the version where they were simply villains and I was simply right, was not quite accurate. And that the accurate version was going to require significantly more from me than the rehearsed one. I looked at Declan. He was looking at the photograph again, and this time, watching his face, I saw the exact moment the math resolved. His head turned, slowly, and his gray eyes found mine with an expression I had never once seen on his face in all the time I had known him. Undone. Completely and quietly undone. "Eliot," he said. His voice had lost its neutrality. Just slightly, just enough. "The boy in the photograph." I held his gaze. My heart was doing something loud and inconvenient. "His name is Micah," I said. The name landed. I watched it land in both of them simultaneously. The way a stone dropped in the still water sends rings outward in all directions. And I thought about a 4-year-old boy asking me this morning if his dad knew where we lived. And I thought about the answer I had given him. And then Declan Ashworth, Alpha King of the Eastern Territory, man who had dissolved our bond in front of 200 people with the clinical efficiency of a policy decision, pressed both hands flat on my counter and looked at me with those gray eyes gone wide and unguarded, and said the 3 words that I had spent 4 years simultaneously dreading and wanting and protecting my son from ever hearing directed at him by someone who wasn't sure they meant them. "Is he mine?" The cafe was completely silent. I looked at Declan. I looked at Rowan. I looked at the photograph of Micah on October light, laughing at something off camera, eyes catching the sun. "He's ours," I said, and the ground, pointing at last, gave way. Nobody moved. That was the thing about moments like this one. You expected noise. You expected someone to knock something over, or raise their voice, or do something that matched the scale of what had just been said. Instead, the three of us just stood there in the quiet of a mid-morning cafe while the espresso machine ticked softly and the October light came through the window at an angle that had no business being that calm. Rowan's cup was still on the counter. Declan's hands were still pressed flat against the surface. My apron strings were still tied in the slightly uneven bow I always made because I'd never bothered to learn the even version. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 60 seconds ago. Nothing was the same as it had been 60 seconds ago. Declan lifted his eyes from the photograph and looked at me with an expression I did not have a category for and did not want to study too closely because studying it would require feeling things about it, and I had a strict feelings budget for today, and it was already completely spent. "Say that again," he said. His voice was low, not commanding, just a man who needed to hear the words one more time, because once was not enough to make them real. "I heard you the first time," I said. "So did you." Rowan made a sound, not quite a word, the sound a person makes when something they have been carrying for a very long time shifts suddenly in their chest and they don't have language for what that feels like. He stood up from the stool slowly, like his legs needed a moment to remember their job. Interim Eliot. His voice was different from every version I had heard this morning. The easy warmth was still there, but it was fractured now, run through with something raw and urgent. 4 years ago, the Bond Dissolution Assembly. You were already... Yes, I said. I was not going to make him finish the sentence because finishing it would take longer, and I was not sure I had the patience for the long version right now. I found out 3 weeks after. Rowan closed his eyes. His emotional signature went through something I could only describe as a collapse. Not dramatic, not loud. The quiet internal collapse of a structure that had been holding up under too much weight for too long and had finally been given permission to come down. Declan, by contrast, went very still in the way that things go still before they become something much larger. His guilt, which I had been feeling all morning as a low persistent pressure, sharpened into something acute, something that had edges. "You were pregnant at the assembly," he said. "I was. And you didn't say anything." I looked at him. I let myself really look at him for the first time since he had walked through the door, without the professional distance or the careful management or the 3 feet of counter between us that I had been treating like a force field. "Declan," I said, and I kept my voice completely even because this was important and I needed it to land correctly. "You dissolved the bond in front of 200 people with the tone of a man closing a business account. What exactly was I supposed to say after that?" His jaw tightened. His emotional signature cracked straight down the middle. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't know." I pulled my apron string, straightened it, just to have something to do with my hands. "That's not the same as it being okay." The words sat between us, honest and unperformed, and I watched them settle into him the way true things settle. Not like blows, but like weight. Something that had to be carried rather than deflected. Rowan opened his eyes. They were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the morning light. "Where did you go?" he asked. "After. Hartford first, then here." "Alone?" "Yes." He absorbed that. The single word, the full weight of everything it contained. Alone. No pack, no resources, no registered territory protections. Pregnant and alone and 23 miles from the place that had just publicly declared she didn't belong there. 19, I thought. I had been 19. I didn't say that. I didn't need to. Rowan was doing the math, and the math was doing damage, and I could feel both things happening simultaneously. "Micah," Rowan said quietly, like he was trying the name out. Like it was something precious that he was afraid of holding wrong. "Is he healthy?" The question surprised me. Not because it was wrong, because it was exactly right. Not who does he look like, or are you sure, or any of the defensive machinery that I had been braced for. Just that. Is he healthy? Something in me shifted half an inch toward him before I could stop it. "He's perfect," and I said. And the word came out with all the feeling I had not been letting anything else carry today. Just that one word. Because Micah was the one subject I could not be strategic about. He's funny and he's smart, and last week he informed me that dinosaurs would have made better pets than dogs because they were more honest about their feelings. Rowan made a sound that was almost a laugh, wet at the edges. He sounds incredible, he said. He is, I said. He's the best thing that has ever happened to me, including several things that happened before the two of you became a complicated chapter in my personal history. Declan made a sound that might, in a different man, have been a laugh. I looked at him. He was looking at the photograph again, not the calculating look from earlier. Something stripped of calculation entirely. A man looking at a child's face with no agenda other than the need to look. His emotional signature right now was the most honest I had felt from him all morning. All the control and the blankness and the careful management had peeled back, and what was underneath was something I hadn't expected. Longing. Simple, uncomplicated, unguarded longing. I did not feel sorry for him. I also did not feel nothing. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and I was choosing not to examine that too closely. I need you to understand something, I said. I kept my voice quiet because the grad students existed, and Bree was somewhere in the back room, and this was not a public conversation. Micah does not know about either of you. He knows he has a father or fathers somewhere. He has asked. When I have not lied to him, but I have also not given him information he couldn't protect himself with yet. Declan looked up from the photograph. He's 4, he said. Not accusatory, just processing. He's 4, I confirmed. And he is the most emotionally perceptive child I have ever met, which I recognize is not entirely unrelated to what I am. And the last thing I will ever do is put him in a situation where he reaches towards something and gets rejected. Not him. He does not get that. Not from anyone. The sentence landed exactly where I intended it to. Declan's expression shifted. The guilt sharpened again, acute and clear, and this time he didn't try to flatten it. I'm not going to reject him, he said. The neutrality was completely gone now. What was left was something raw and very certain. You don't know him yet, I said. No, he agreed. I don't, and that is something I would like to change. He paused. His voice, when he continued, had lost all its alpha authority and was just a man talking. If you'll let me, if you'll let us. Rowan moved closer to the counter. Not aggressive, just closing the distance in the way he did everything, like proximity was natural, and space between people was the thing that needed explanation. We're not here to take anything from you, he said. Not your choices, not your story, not control of anything. We just want the chance to know him and to do right by you. Finally. The word finally carried 4 years in it. I looked at both of them. My ability was not behaving. It was reading them both clearly, and what it was reading was consistent and real and not remotely what I had spent 4 years building my defenses against. I had prepared for anger. I had prepared for denial and legal maneuvering and the particular cold efficiency of powerful men protecting their interests. I had not prepared for this. For 2 men standing in a coffee shop looking at a photograph of a little boy with visible hunger and guilt and grief and the specific quality of wanting that had no agenda behind it. It made everything harder, which was deeply inconvenient. I need to think, I said. Of course, Rowan said immediately. That means I need you both to leave my café so I can finish my shift without my hands shaking. Rowan looked at my hands. My hands were objectively fine, completely still. I was simply making a point about internal states versus external presentation, and he seemed to understand that because he nodded without argument. Declan reached into his coat. He set a card on the counter. Plain, white, just a number. No name, no title. When you're ready, he said. He said it like he meant it. Like ready could take as long as it needed to, and he would wait. I looked at the card. I did not pick it up, but I also did not put it in the trash, which 4 years ago would have been an automatic reflex, and today was apparently not. Rowan buttoned his coat. He paused at the counter for one moment, and what he said was quiet enough that it was only for me. He asked you about his dad, he said. I felt it on you the second I walked in. That particular weight. He held my gaze steady and sure. I'm sorry it took us this long. I'm sorry you carried it alone. I mean that. My throat did something I told it not to do. Good coffee, I said. His mouth curved, sad and warm in equal measure. "The best I've ever had," he said. They left. The bell above the door chimed twice. The cafe settled back into its ordinary sounds. The espresso machine, the street noise, the distant typing of grad students who would never know that something enormous had just happened, 4 tables away from them. I stood behind my counter. I breathed in, breathed out. I looked at the photograph of Micah on the counter, his frog hat, his wide-open laugh, his impossible eyes. Then I looked at the card Declan had left. Just a number, plain and white and sitting on my counter like a question I had not agreed to answer yet. I picked it up. I put it in my apron pocket. And I thought with the complicated, exhausted, terrifyingly alive feeling of someone whose carefully managed life had just cracked open and let the light in whether they wanted it or not. "Okay, Micah, your father's found us. Now comes the hard part." I finished my shift. That sounds simple. It was not simple. It was 1 hour and 11 minutes of making coffee and smiling at customers and answering Bree's very pointed questions about what had happened at the counter with her carefully constructed non-answers, all while carrying the weight of a business card in my apron pocket that somehow felt heavier than my phone, my keys, and 4 years of accumulated survival instincts combined. Bree lasted until 11:08 before she cracked. "Okay, I need you to tell me something," she said, refilling the oat milk behind the counter with the focused energy of a person who had been exercising restraint and was done with it. "Because Declan Ashworth does not come into independent cafes and leave his personal number with baristas. That does not happen. I have lived in pack-adjacent spaces my whole life, and that does not happen." "He liked the coffee," I said. "Eliot, it's very good coffee, Bree. He looked at you like you were something he lost." I stopped wiping the counter. She wasn't wrong. She was 21 and perceptive, and she was not wrong, and I resented both of those things. "People look at things lots of ways," I said. "Ring up table 4. She rang up table 4, but she looked at me the whole time with the expression of someone filing information away for later, which was her right as a person and a mild inconvenience as my coworker. At 11:14, I untied my apron, hung it on the back hook, retrieved my jacket from the staff cubby, and walked out into the October air on Chapel Street, feeling like a person who had survived something significant and had not yet decided how to feel about having survived it. The cold hit me clean and sharp. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let it. The business card was in my jacket pocket now, transferred from the apron with the casual efficiency of someone who was definitely not thinking about it. I was thinking about Micah. I was thinking about little seeds in the 12:30 early pickup I had arranged for Wednesdays because the afternoon bus route on Wednesdays was unreliable, and I had learned that the hard way in September. I was also thinking about what Rowan had said. "I felt it on you the second I walked in." That particular weight, my ability read emotions. That was the direction it ran. Outward to inward, other people's feelings into my awareness. It did not run the other direction. I did not broadcast. I did not leak. I had spent years making absolutely certain of that because an Omega who broadcast emotional states in pack-adjacent spaces was an Omega who got noticed, and an Omega who got noticed without registration was an Omega who got reported, which meant Rowan had not felt my emotional state through any supernatural channel. He had just looked at me and known, without ability, without scent bond, without any of the Omegaverse mechanics that were supposed to explain these things. And he had walked into a cafe and looked at a stranger behind a counter and felt the weight of what that stranger was carrying and named it correctly. That was somehow more unsettling than if it had been the bond. The bond I could categorize. The bond had rules and biology and a framework I understood. A man who simply saw me clearly after 30 seconds had no framework and no rules, and produced a feeling in my chest that I was currently classifying as a threat and moving on. I started walking toward the bus stop. My phone buzzed. "Miss Patricia, Little Seeds." "Eliot, honey, nothing wrong. Micah is fine. Could you call me when you get a chance? Small thing to discuss." Small thing to discuss was daycare professional language for something that needed a conversation, and I picked up my pace slightly because my nervous system had already had enough today, and small thing to discuss had a wide range of possible meanings, and I needed to know which one this was. I called her from the bus stop. She picked up on the second ring. "He's completely fine," she said first. which I appreciated because she understood how my brain worked. He had a wonderful morning. He taught the other kids a song about a horse in a cowboy hat, which they all found very compelling. That tracks, I said. What's the small thing? A brief pause. There were two men outside the center this morning, she said. Around 9:30. They didn't come in. They didn't approach any of the children. But they were parked outside for about 40 minutes, and I have a policy about vehicles that linger, so I wrote down the plate and had my husband run it. The October air was suddenly much colder than it had been. What came back? I asked. My voice was completely steady. A vehicle registered to Ashworth Eastern Territory, PAC Administration, she said carefully. Eliot, I don't want to alarm you, but I know your situation, and I know you're unregistered, and I thought you should know. I stood very still at the bus stop. Around me, New Haven moved at its ordinary Thursday pace. A student on a bike, a woman with a stroller, a city bus sighing to a stop half a block down. In my chest, something that had been cautiously, tentatively beginning to open in the last 2 hours, slammed shut with a sound only I could hear. Thank you, I said. I'm on my way. I hung up. I stood there for 3 more seconds. Then I took the business card out of my pocket. I looked at it, plain white. Just a number. The card of a man who had said when you're ready like he meant it. Like ready could take as long as I needed. Like he understood that trust was not something you demanded, it was something you waited for. While sending vehicles to park outside my son's daycare, the feeling that moved through me was not clean anger. I wanted it to be clean anger because clean anger was useful and had direction and kept you from feeling the other things underneath it. But it was not clean. It was the specific compound emotion of someone who had allowed themselves, for the space of 1 hour in a coffee shop, to consider the possibility that this time might be different, and had been reminded before the hour was even cold why different was a thing you did not get to have. I had read them. I had sat across from both of them with my ability running, and I had read them as genuine, and I had believed what I read, and I had kept the card and thought, okay, now comes the hard part. Like the hard part was something I was ready to try. And somewhere between leaving the cafe and me untying my apron, one of them had sent people to my son's daycare. I called the number on the card. It rang twice. Declan picked up. Eliot. His voice was careful and a little surprised. The careful surprise of a man who had not expected the call this soon. There was a vehicle registered to your PAC administration parked outside my son's daycare this morning, I said, for 40 minutes, starting at 9:30, which is approximately the same time you were sitting in my cafe asking me questions about his age. Silence. Not the silence of a man caught, the silence of a man processing something that had blindsided him. That wasn't me, he said. Declan. Eliot, I am telling you that was not a directive I gave. His voice had changed. The careful neutrality was gone entirely, replaced with something tight and controlled that was not quite anger and not quite alarm, but lived in the space between them. I need you to stay where you are. I need you to go get your son and stay where you are, and I will call you back in 10 minutes. I'm not taking instructions from you. That's fair, he said, and the quickness of it startled me. No pushback, no authority, just acknowledgement. Then I'm asking, please go get Micah. Sure, please stay somewhere you feel safe. I will call you back in 10 minutes and I will explain what I know and you can decide what to do with it. I breathed in through my nose. 10 minutes, I said. 10 minutes, he confirmed. I hung up. The bus came. I got on it and stood in the aisle holding the overhead bar while New Haven moved past the windows, and I thought about the word safe and what it meant and who got to define it, and the fact that I had been defining it alone for 4 years and had gotten reasonably good at it, and today had cracked something open in me that was going to make alone harder to maintain. I did not want that. I had not asked for that. My phone buzzed again at the 7-minute mark. Not Declan. Rowan. I stared at his name on the screen for 2 full bus stops. I picked up. I know about the vehicle, he said before I could speak. His voice was not careful. It was direct and slightly rough in the way voices got when a person was genuinely upset and not performing it. It wasn't Declan and it wasn't me. It was Miles. He ran a standard new territory background sweep this morning, and your daycare address came up in the residential proximity search because it's 2 blocks from our secondary location site, and he sent a visual confirmation team without telling either of us. I processed that. A background sweep, I said. Standard protocol for new territory establishment. He didn't know. He had no idea about Micah or about you or about any of what happened this morning. To him, it was a routine address on a proximity list. A pause. I fired him. I blinked. You fired him. Effective 20 minutes ago. Yes. Rowan, that's your PAC advisor. I'm aware of what he was. His voice was very steady. He put a surveillance vehicle outside a child's daycare without authorization and without understanding the context, and I will not have people in my administration who make that call. That is not the kind of territory we are building here. I stood on the bus with my hand around the overhead bar and felt something move through me that I genuinely did not have a name for. It was not softness. It was not forgiveness. It was not the cautious warmth that had been trying to exist in me since Rowan had said, "I'm sorry you carried it alone," like he meant every syllable. It was something older and more animal than any of those things. It was my ability reading a man's emotional signature and finding it completely consistent with his words, in the specific disorienting experience of not being able to find the lie. That doesn't fix it, I said. I know, he said. I'm not trying to fix it with one phone call. I just needed you to know the truth before you decided anything. The bus stopped. My stop. I stood up. I'm getting my son, I said. Good, he said. Like that was the right answer. Like Micah being retrieved and safe was the only thing that actually mattered in this equation, and everything else was secondary. I stepped off the bus into the cold air. Rowan. I stopped on the sidewalk outside Little Seeds. The painted sunflowers on the front window, bright and cheerful against the gray October sky. If anything, and I mean anything, that comes from either of you touches my son's life before I say so, I will disappear so completely that your entire PAC administration and every proximity search in the state of Connecticut will not find a trace of us. Do you understand me? A beat of silence. I understand you, he said quietly, and I believe you. Good. I hung up. I pushed open the door of Little Seeds. Micah was sitting at a craft table, making what appeared to be a turkey out of his own handprint, fully absorbed, his dinosaur backpack hanging on his hook by the door, with his name written on the tag in my handwriting. He looked up when I came in. His face did the thing it always did when he saw me. Just lit. No performance, no adjustment, just pure, uncomplicated joy, the kind that only existed in people who had not yet learned to protect it. Daddy, he said, like the word was its own complete sentence. I crossed the room and I picked him up, and he pressed his cold nose against my neck the same way he had at 3 a.m., and I held him with both arms and breathed him in, cinnamon and crayon and the warm particular scent of my son. And I thought about 2 men and a business card and a vehicle outside this building, and the fact that the hard part had apparently started approximately 40 minutes earlier than I had anticipated. Can we get hot chocolate? He asked into my shoulder. Yes, I said. With the little marshmallows? All the marshmallows. He pulled back and looked at my face with those honey-colored eyes that had started this whole day, reading me the way he always did, with the specific perceptiveness of a child who had learned early that his father's face contained important information. Are you okay? He asked. 4 years old. 4 years old and asking me if I was okay. I'm great, I said. Let's go. He believed me. For now, he still believed me, and I held that, along with him, and walked back out into the October afternoon, carrying both like they were the only things keeping me upright. Because they were. The hot chocolate place was called Copper and Cream, 4 blocks from Little Seeds. A small, warm pocket of a café that had nothing to do with Anchor and Stone, and everything to do with the fact that Micah had discovered their marshmallow situation in August and had been emotionally committed to it ever since. We sat at the window table. Micah had his hands wrapped around a mug approximately the size of his torso, working through the marshmallows with systematic dedication, fishing each one out individually with a small spoon and eating them before touching the chocolate. He had a method. He had always had a method. 4 years old and already a person with opinions and systems and a very specific relationship with the order of operations. I had a black coffee. I was not drinking. I was watching him. Not in the anxious way, not the way I sometimes caught myself watching him when the fear got loud and I needed to confirm with my own eyes that he was still here and still fine and nothing had gotten through. This was different. This was the watching you did when you were trying to memorize something you already knew by heart, when the familiar became suddenly acutely precious in a way that hurt a little. He looked like Rowan when he concentrated. I had known that for 2 years and had never let myself say it out loud, and here it was anyway, sitting across from me at a window table in October, fishing marshmallows out of hot chocolate with a tiny spoon. He had Declan's jaw, soft still, rounded with childhood, but the structure underneath was there if you knew what you were looking for. I knew what I was looking for. I pressed my thumb against the edge of my coffee cup and thought about choices. The choices I understood it had 3 options. Option 1, disappear. Take the $412 in my savings account, which was not enough but was something. Collect Micah, get on a bus heading anywhere that was not New Haven, Connecticut, and start the process I had started once before in a Greyhound station in Hartford. New city, new name, new café. I had done it. I could do it again. The problem with option 1 was Micah. Not that he would resist, he was for. He went where I went with the complete trust of a child who had never been given a reason not to. The problem was that I had made a promise to him, not out loud, not in words he could hold me to, but in every decision I had made since the moment I understood I was keeping him. The promise was this: I would not let my fear be the thing that limited his life. Running had been right when I was 19 and pregnant, and had no resources and 2 men who had just publicly closed the door. Running now, when those men were standing on the other side of the door asking for it to open, was a different thing. Running now was not protection, it was avoidance wearing protection's clothes. I knew the difference. Option 2, call the PAC authority. It'll register. File the bond dissolution violation that Rowan had named this morning. The one that apparently had a legal framework and 8 months of someone else building a case around it. Let the institutional machinery handle it. Let lawyers and PAC law and the formal apparatus of territory governance manage what 2 men and 1 omega could not seem to manage in a coffee shop. The problem with option 2 was that I did not trust the PAC authority as far as I could throw the PAC authority, and given that I had telekinesis, I could technically throw it quite far. But the sentiment stood. Institutional machinery protected people with registration and resources and connections, and did interesting creative things to people without them. Son and I had spent 4 years watching it do those interesting creative things to people who looked like me, and I was not enthusiastic about becoming a case number, which left option 3. Option 3 was the one I had been avoiding since I walked out of Anchor and Stone with a business card in my apron pocket. Option 3 was the hardest one and the only one that was actually honest. Option 3 was stay, talk, set terms I meant and held to. Let 2 men who had failed me once have the chance to do something other than fail. Not because they deserved the chance, not because 4 years of searching earned anything, but because Micah deserved to know his fathers if his fathers were willing to be known. And because I was 23 years old and tired of carrying everything alone, and that was a true thing I was allowed to say, even if saying it scared me. Micah looked up from his marshmallow operation. "Daddy," he said, "you're thinking loud." I blinked. "I'm not making any noise." "You do this thing with your face," he demonstrated, pulling his brows together in a concentrated frown, which was apparently what I looked like when I was having an internal crisis, and which was both accurate and slightly humbling. "When you're figuring something out." "You're very observant," I said. "Ms. Patricia says I got it from you." "Ms. Patricia is correct." I picked up my coffee. Finally drank some. "I'm just thinking about something that happened today." "Something bad?" I looked at him across the table. At Rowan's eyes and Declan's jaw, and my own stubborn set to his shoulders, 3 people in one small face, and I thought about the word bad, and whether it was the right word for what today had been. "Something big," I said. "Not bad, just big." He considered this with the serious expression he reserved for important information. "Is it bigger than the time the radiator made that sound?" he asked. "What sound?" "The sound like it was saying goodbye to someone." I stared at him. "Yes," I said. "It's bigger than that." Okay, he returned to his marshmallows. You'll figure it out. You always figure it out. The simplicity of his confidence in me sat in my chest like a hand pressed gently against a bruise. I put my coffee down. I took out my phone. I opened the messages and I typed. Way before I could reconsider it or talk myself back into one of the other options or let my fear get a vote it hadn't earned. Park, East Rock, 2 p.m. Bring no one else. I sent it to Declan's number. Then I sent the same message to Rowan. Then I put my phone face down on the table and ate one of Micah's remaining marshmallows, which he noticed immediately. Hey, he said. Finder's fee, I said. That's not a rule. It is now. I made it. He looked at me with the specific expression of someone deciding whether to argue, determined that the marshmallow was already gone, and argument was therefore unproductive, and returned to his mug. I loved him so much it was almost a physical sensation. My phone buzzed. Declan. We'll be there. 30 seconds later, Rowan. We'll be there. Thank you. I turned the phone back over. Thank you. And were 2 words, quiet and genuine in carrying no assumption that thank you was enough. Just the acknowledgement of what was being offered and the care not to make it bigger than I had made it. I sat with that for a moment. Then I finished my coffee, helped Micah into his jacket, and we walked out into the afternoon. East Rock Park in October was the kind of beautiful that New Haven did when it was trying to remind you why you stayed. The trees had gone full color, amber and copper, and a red so saturated it looked almost intentional. And the path along the lower ridge was quiet at midday, with just the occasional dog walker and a woman pushing a stroller and the distant sound of kids somewhere near the playground. I had left Micah with Ms. Patricia for an extra hour. I had told him I had an errand. Well, he had asked if the errand involved the big thing I was figuring out, and I had said yes, and he had said okay, and given me a high five with the solemn authority of a child deputizing a parent for an important mission. I was standing on the ridge path with my hands in my jacket pockets when I heard them coming. No SUVs this time. On foot from the lower entrance, moving through the amber light with the unhurried pace of men who were trying very hard not to look like they were nervous and were not entirely succeeding. My ability read them from 30 feet away. Declan. Controlled surface. Underneath it, something that had been running at high intensity all day and was starting to fray at the edges. Guilt still there, sharper now, more specific, and underneath everything, that longing I had felt when he looked at the photograph. He's still there, unperformed, just present. Rowan. The grief was quieter than it had been this morning, like something that had been wound tight had been given slightly more room. Underneath it, warmth and nerves running together, and that specific quality of careful intention. A man who was thinking very hard about every word before it left his mouth. They stopped a few feet away. The 3 of us stood on a ridge path in East Rock Park, with the October trees around us and the city visible below, and the particular atmosphere of a conversation that had been building for 4 years and was finally unavoidably here. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said, I have conditions. Declan nodded. One single nod, immediate, no negotiation in it. Tell us, Rowan said. Micah does not know who you are yet, I said. Not until I decide the timing is right. You do not push that. You do not hint at it. You do not try to build something with him that goes around me. You do not make me the obstacle between him and a truth he deserves to receive with care. Agreed, Declan said. Any contact with his life, his school, his spaces goes through me first. Not your administration, not your advisors, not a proximity search that somehow generates a surveillance vehicle. Me. Agreed, Rowan said, and his voice had something in it that sounded like the word was also an apology. I am not a PAC member. I am not registering under Ashworth or Calloway territory until I decide independently that registration serves me and my son. That is not a negotiating point. That is a fact. Declan's jaw shifted. I felt the instinctive alpha resistance to that particular sentence move through him like a current he was actively choosing not to follow. Understood, he said. The word cost him something. He said it anyway. I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked at Rowan. I read emotions, I said. That is what my ability does. I have been reading both of you all day, and I want you to know that, because I am not interested in any version of this where you perform something for my benefit. Whatever you are, be that. I will know the difference. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. Rowan looked at me with an expression that was almost startled. The specific look of a person who has been seen more clearly than they expected and is deciding how to feel about it. Declan looked at me with an expression I had not seen on him before, something that was close to respect. Not the social acknowledgement of a superior for a subordinate. Something more level than that. The respect of a person for another person who had just told a precise and uncomfortable truth without flinching. I believed I was making a necessary decision, Declan said, 4 years ago. I had reasons that I told myself were about pack stability and political necessity in the long term. He paused, the guilt sharpened to a point. I have spent a significant amount of time since then understanding that those reasons were real and also insufficient. That I made a choice that affected your life profoundly and made it without fully reckoning with what that meant for you. He stopped. He did not follow it with a but. I waited for the but. There was no but. That's the most honest thing you've said to me since you walked into my cafe, I said. I know, he said. I'm trying to do better than I was at 19. You were 24, I said. I know that too. His mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite a grimace. That's worse. Rowan made a sound that was half laugh, half something more complicated. I wasn't there, he said. That is the thing I cannot explain away or reframe or make into something other than what it is. I was not there because I prioritized something else, and I have no version of that choice that holds up under honest examination. He held my gaze. I'm not asking you to forgive either of us today, he said. I'm not asking for anything today except the chance to prove over time that we understand what we did and that we are different from the men who did it. That's it. That's the ask. The trees moved in the October wind. Somewhere below, the city went about its business. My ability was very quiet in that moment, not because I had pulled it back, but because there was nothing contradictory to process. What they were saying matched what they were feeling, with a consistency that left me nothing to argue with. That was the most terrifying thing of all. My son likes horses, I said, and dinosaurs, and songs. He is the funniest person I have ever met, and he has your eyes, I said to Rowan, and your jaw, I said to Declan, and my complete refusal to back down from anything, which he demonstrated last Tuesday when he told Ms. Patricia that nap time was a societal construct. Rowan's face broke open, full, unguarded, the grief and the warmth colliding into something that looked like the beginning of joy. Declan made a sound, low and quiet, surprised out of him, the laugh of a man who had not expected to laugh and was slightly undone by the fact that he had. I looked at both of them. You don't get to love him yet, I said. That is something that has to be earned, and it will take time, and it will not be on your schedule. We know, Rowan said. But you can start, I said, if you mean what you said. The wind moved through the copper trees. Both of them looked at me with the same expression, different in texture but identical in direction. Two men standing on a ridge in the October light, understanding that they had been given something they had not earned and intended, this time to be worthy of it. I turned and looked out over the city. $14 in my bank account. A son who ate marshmallows in a specific order and asked if my errand was about the big thing I was figuring out. A business card I had not thrown away. 2 men standing behind me who smelled like pine resin and thunderstorm, cedar smoke and river water, and who were, for the first time in 4 years, not walking away. I breathed in the cold air. I had never needed anyone to save me, but I had been so tired for so long, and the October light was genuinely beautiful. And somewhere across the city, a small boy was making a handprint turkey and waiting for me to come back. I turned around. I work Tuesdays and Thursdays at Anchor and Stone Out, I said. If either of you happen to need coffee. Rowan smiled. Declan looked at me for a long moment. Then quietly he said, we'll be there. The words settled into the October air like something that had always belonged there. I did not hug them. I did not cry. I did not do anything that would suggest the last 6 hours had broken through every wall I had spent 4 years building, even though they had, because I had a reputation for composure to maintain, and I intended to maintain it all the way to the ground. What I did was nod. One single nod, the same one Declan had given me earlier, and I watched something move through both of them at the recognition of it. Rowan's mouth curved. Declan's eyes warmed by exactly 1 degree. Which on his face was the emotional equivalent of a standing ovation. Tuesday, I said. Tuesday, Rowan confirmed. I turned and walked back down the ridge path toward the lower entrance, and I did not look back, not because I was being dramatic, but because if I looked back, I was going to see two men standing in the copper light watching me leave, and I was not ready for what that would do to something that was just beginning to be brave inside my chest. I made it to the park entrance. Then I stopped, breathed, pressed one hand flat against the cool stone of the entrance pillar, and let myself feel, for exactly 30 seconds, everything I had been managing all day. The shock of seeing Declan's face, the wave of Rowan's grief, the photograph, the business card, the surveillance vehicle that had nearly ended this before it started. Watch the ridge, the conditions, the 1 inch of open door, 30 seconds. Then I straightened my jacket, took my hand off the pillar, and went to get my son. Micah was in the middle of a very important debate with another child named Oscar about whether a triceratops could beat a tank when I arrived at Little Seeds. He paused the debate long enough to register my presence, assess my face with his specific 4-year-old perceptiveness, and determine that the big thing had been figured out satisfactorily. He returned to the debate. Triceratops wins, I said on my way past. Oscar looked betrayed. Micah looked vindicated. Miss Patricia, collecting craft supplies nearby, caught my eye over both their heads. You okay? She asked quietly. I thought about everything that word had contained today. Rowan asking it without asking. Micah asking it at the window table with his marshmallow spoon. Miss Patricia asking it now with the steady warmth of a woman who had been quietly, consistently in our corner for 4 months. Getting there, I said. She nodded like that was exactly the right answer. We walked home in the late afternoon light, Micah's hand in mine, his dinosaur backpack bouncing, his account of the Triceratops debate detailed and thorough, and featuring several dramatic reenactments that required him to use both hands, which meant he periodically let go of me to demonstrate a horn attack and then grab my hand again without looking, just reaching, trusting I was still there. I was always still there. The radiator was doing its dying robot impression when we got home. I made dinner, real dinner, a pasta with the good sauce from the jar I saved for days that needed it. And Micah sat at the kitchen table and told me everything about his day in the particular order his brain filed things, which was emotional significance rather than chronology. The horse song came first. Oscar's Triceratops opinions came last and were delivered with the gravity they deserved. After dinner, after the bath, after the 3 stories that became 4, because he had a gift for finding natural cliffhangers right before the end of each one, I sat on the edge of his bed in the dark and listened to him breathe. He was almost asleep. Almost. Daddy, he said, from the soft edge of consciousness. Yeah, bud. Did you figure out the big thing? I looked at his face in the dark. The impossible eyes closed now, lashes dark against his cheeks, one fist pressed against his chin the way he always slept. I started to, I said. Good. A pause. Almost gone. I knew you would. He was asleep before I could answer. I sat there for another minute. Then I got up, went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stood at the window looking out at the Elm Street night, and allowed myself, quietly and without performance, to feel something that had not been fully available to me in 4 years. Hope. Not the desperate kind. Not the kind that needed things to be perfect or guaranteed or safe in all directions. Just the ordinary human kind that said, tomorrow exists and it might be different from today, and different might be good. My phone was on the counter. I picked it up. I opened a new message to Rowan's number, asked because Rowan had said I felt the weight on you the second I walked in and had fired his pack advisor and had stood on a ridge and not asked for forgiveness, just for the chance to earn something, and that was not nothing. I typed, He likes cinnamon in his oatmeal. I don't know why I'm telling you that. I think I just wanted someone else to know. I sent it before I could reconsider. 3 dots appeared immediately. Rowan, thank you for telling me. I'll remember. Then after a brief pause, he sounds like he has excellent taste. Then, get some rest, Eliot. You did something really hard today. I put my phone down. I pressed my fingers briefly against my eyes. Then I sent one message to Declan. Shorter. Just 4 words because Declan was a man who processed best with space and precision rather than warmth. And I understood that about him, even after 4 years and 1 hard day. Tuesday, don't be late. His response came back in under a minute. Declan, I won't be. 3 weeks later, it was a Tuesday. Micah sat at the counter of Anchor and Stone, on the high stool I had pulled out for him, wearing his frog hat because it was November now, and cold enough to justify it, eating a chocolate chip muffin with the focused dedication he applied to all important tasks. Declan was on the stool beside him. They were not talking about anything significant. Declan had asked in his careful, precise way what Micah thought about the muffin, and Micah had given him a detailed structural analysis of the chocolate chip distribution that had been going for 4 minutes and showed no signs of concluding. Declan was listening, not performing listening, actually listening with the focused attention he gave to things he found genuinely important. And I watched from behind the espresso machine as something in his face did a slow, quiet thing that I did not have a word for yet. I was working on a word for it. Rowan was at the window table with a honey latte in his tablet, and he kept looking up at the counter every 30 seconds with the helpless regularity of someone who could not stop checking that something wonderful was still there. Every time he looked up, I looked away. Every time I looked away, Bree gave me a look that said she saw everything and was saving it all for later. I was going to need new coworkers. The bottom half has more chips, Micah was telling Declan, with the authority of someone who had researched this extensively. Because chips sink. Look, it's gravity. That's accurate, Declan said. Density differential during the baking process. Micah stared at him. Yeah, he said. That. Declan looked at the muffin, then at Micah, then at me across the counter, a brief glance, and what I felt from him in that single second was something clean and uncomplicated and real. Gratitude. Not for forgiveness, because I had not given that yet, and he was not asking for it yet. For this. For a Tuesday morning and a high stool and a 4-year-old explaining muffin physics with complete authority. For the chance. I turned back to the espresso machine. My power was quiet today, settled in a way it rarely was in crowds. I thought about why and arrived at an answer I did not immediately hate. Because for the first time in a long time, the emotions in my immediate environment were not things I needed to manage or protect against. They were just people. My complicated, unresolved, genuinely trying people, sitting in my cafe on a Tuesday. Rowan appeared at the counter. Can I get a refill? He asked. You have 3/4 of a latte, I said. I know. He set the cup on the counter. His eyes were warm and slightly nervous, and exactly the color I had described to Micah 8 months ago. I needed an excuse to come over here. I looked at him. He looked back. How are you doing? He asked. Just that. Just the question. Plain and genuine. The same weight it had carried every time something real had passed between us today. Better, I said. His mouth curved. Yeah? Don't make it weird, I said. He laughed, full and warm and real. The grief underneath him quieter today than it had ever been, and I felt it shift as he laughed. Felt the warmth in him move through the grief the way light moved through water, changing its color without erasing it. I refilled his latte. When I handed it back, our fingers touched the same way they had that first morning, brief and incidental, and carrying a current that had nothing incidental about it. Neither of us moved for 1 second longer than the exchange required. Then Micah said loudly from the counter stool, Daddy, this man knows about dinosaurs too. I looked over. Declan had apparently transitioned from muffin physics to paleontology, and Micah was looking at him with the expression he reserved for people who had passed an important test. Does he? I said. He said a triceratops could beat a tank, Micah reported. Nausea because of the psychological element. I looked at Declan. Declan looked at me with the composed expression of a man who had just made a 4-year-old extremely happy and was working very hard not to show how that felt. He was not entirely succeeding. "He's right," I said. Micah pointed at Declan. "I like this one," he announced to no one and everyone. Something cracked open in Declan's face. Not breaking, opening. The way a window opened, letting in the cold November air and the light together, both at once. He pressed his lips together, looked down at the counter, breathed, and when he looked back up at me, past Micah's frog hat, past the muffin and the muffin physics, and all the careful distance of the last 3 weeks, his gray eyes were completely unguarded for the first time since I had known him. Not asking for anything. Just there. Just finally, honestly. All the way there. I turned back to the espresso machine before he could see what his face did to mine. But I was smiling. Not the professional smile. Not the Eliot, the barista smile. The real one. The one I saved for Micah's horse dreams and frog hats, and the specific joy of a person who had survived something hard and come out the other side to find that the other side was, against all reasonable expectation, beautiful. Outside, November moved through the New Haven streets. Inside, the espresso machine hissed, and the window light was warm, and a small boy in a frog hat was explaining the psychological element of Triceratops warfare to an alpha king who was listening like every word was the most important thing he had ever heard. I thought about $14. I thought about 2 sad apples. I thought about a Greyhound station bathroom in Hartford and a vending machine test and the specific quality of silence when you understand that the life you thought you were building had ended. And then I thought about how sometimes things ended so that different things could begin. How sometimes the rejection was not the whole story. How sometimes the starving boy became someone who fed other people. How sometimes the child no one claimed became the reason everyone finally showed up. Micah laughed at something Declan said. The sound moved through the cafe like the first warm day after a long winter, and every single person in the room looked up without knowing why, drawn toward it the way people were drawn toward things that were simply, undeniably alive. I let myself hear it, all of it, every bright particular note of it, and I thought, with the full quiet certainty of someone who had finally, at last, put down something too heavy to carry alone. We're going to be okay. All of us. We're going to be more than okay. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed it, you'll definitely love the next one. It's even crazier and more intriguing than you can imagine. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned. The next story drops soon.